Hello friends! I'm excited to share with you today about my symptoms. So that's a big question that I've been asked is, did you have symptoms? What were your symptoms? How did you know that you were sick? And so I'm going to fill you in on all of that. Now this is a journey over months. And so I just want to start by saying that my symptoms were my own. My presentation was unique to me. My body responded and reacted to things different than how other people's will. And signs and symptoms can be very different for each person. So I'm going to walk you through my story. And now my story is a little bit unique because I am a 30-year-old, and besides this, I was an otherwise very extremely healthy 30-year-old female. And so the first time I noticed my symptoms was the end of February. And now with that being said, I received my diagnosis or started treatment the first week of May of 2023. So I started noticing symptoms the end of February of 2023. And the first symptoms that I started acknowledging was a cough. And when my cough first started, it was during huge allergy time in Florida where most people were having allergies and a cough. So I thought that's what I was experiencing. And when I say I had a cough, it was like a throat clearing type of cough once or twice a day. It was not a severe cough like I ended up having months later. And so the cough was the first thing that started for me. And around the same time, I started just feeling really fatigued. And part of my story was I had rationalizations for the different symptoms that I was experiencing. Because for me, I would have one symptom and then a couple weeks later, I would have another symptom. I was having different symptoms, but they were happening at isolated times. They weren't all happening together. And so over the course of time, my cough was progressing, but so was my fatigue to the point where I just felt completely burnt out. And now I had been doing a lot of work in my office, growing my businesses, expanding growth. I had been really working hard on that. So I thought I just needed a break. I am a wife, I'm a mom of 2 little boys, I'm a business owner. I do all of the things. I was training for a triathlon. I was busy, and I hate saying that, but I was busy. I had a lot on my plate, and so I thought the fatigue was just because the amount of things that I was doing. Now, with that being said, a big lesson that we all need to learn is that self-care is not selfish, and prioritizing rest is probably the best thing that you can do for your mental, physical, and emotional health. And I will always be prioritizing rest from now on, but I did not at the time. And so I had an event in the office. We hosted a ladies' night event here, and that was a pivotal moment for me where I just remember having to sit at the front desk and just sit. I did not have the energy to talk to people. I wasn't hungry. My appetite was really off, and I was just having a hard time getting up and going. And so the fatigue just kept building and building to a point where I was falling asleep reading my books each night. I was falling asleep in my full makeup. I couldn't even go through a normal bedtime routine because by the end of the day, I was so tired. And then I would go to sleep and I would have night sweats. And now at the time, I thought I was just going through a hormonal shift because I was still nursing my son up until I started chemo, and he had been nursing less, so I thought I was having some hormone swings and some night sweats because of that. So far, I've had a cough, fatigue, and night sweats. And now I mentioned I was training for a triathlon, so I was working out a lot. I was working out 6 or 7 days a week for at least an hour each time. I was boxing, running, cycling, doing yoga, weight training. I was doing all of the things. And so I was working really hard and I was losing weight, which I thought was because of the amount of working out that I was doing. But I just named a couple of 3 really classic signs that are called B symptoms, which is fever, night sweats, and weight loss. And so I did have all 3. The fever did not start until 3 weeks prior to my diagnosis. And so when we go back in time now, looking back, I started having excruciating back pain in December. and it was off and on. It would happen at the end of a work week, so I figured it was due to the physical toll on my body. But looking back and talking to my doctor, we now think that that was one of the first symptoms that I had of being sick, was back pain, which as a chiropractor is a very interesting thing because it had a unique presentation. It really seemed very musculoskeletal. I could even pinpoint the pain to the touch, and it was reproducible. So it was a weird thing that was happening. I'm not really sure what was causing that or if it was the tumor, but I will say that I'm not having that pain anymore. So the beginning of my symptoms were the back pain, the fatigue, and I also started having headaches, which is something that I do not typically experience, but I was having headaches here and there. I didn't have a ton of them, but I do remember having a few of them. And it got to a point where after a couple months of feeling so tired and just off, I had said to my husband, I'm not sure what's wrong, but I almost feel like I'm depressed. There is not a certain thing that I can pinpoint that's causing me to feel this way, but I don't feel right. I feel off. Something's wrong. And then from there, everything really just unraveled, and I started having my symptoms worse, and I started having things more happen all at one time. So with my diagnosis, I had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and mine was primary mediastinal. So for me, my symptoms were very much respiratory and related to my chest, heart, and lungs, because my lymphoma did not start in a lymph node, it started in my chest. And so I started having shortness of breath to the point where it got so bad that I could not talk through a full sentence without gasping for air. And when that started happening, I started having a really bad cough. And at this point in time was when I started having trouble laying flat. And so when my breathing and cough got really bad, when I laid flat, I just couldn't breathe, and it would signal a coughing fit. So I started having to increase how I was sleeping by sitting up a little bit, more pillows. And by the end, right before I went to the hospital, I had to be sitting up completely straight to even sleep because I could not breathe any other way. So my symptoms were kind of all over the place. But 3 weeks before my diagnosis, we had taken a little weekend trip. It was the break that I thought I needed to get through the burnout. And we did Disney on Friday, and then on Saturday we went to an arcade with the boys, and I just could not keep up. Now my boys are full of energy. They are almost 2 and 5, so at this point in time they were 1 and 4, and they just, I could not keep up. They're always like that, but I'm like that too. So I don't have trouble keeping up with my kids, but I couldn't pick the baby up one more time. I was so tired. And so when we went home that day from the arcade, I just laid in bed in the Airbnb for the rest of the day. I felt like I had a fever. I felt very flu-like. And so the next morning we went home, and I spent that whole day in the bed just feeling really feverish. Chills, fatigue. For me, I get like burning eyes, and I just felt really sick. And I checked my temperature, and I didn't have a temperature. So hung out that day in bed. The next morning it was time to get ready for work. And just remember sinking down onto my bathroom floor, just in a ball, crying because I was so fatigued and I felt so sick that I didn't know if I could go to work that day. And at this point in time, we had no idea what was wrong. And so I checked my temperature again, and I didn't have a fever. Come to find out later that day, we will realize the thermometer was broken, but story of my life. So my husband said, just don't go to work today, we'll close, it's fine. For anyone who knows me, I take my responsibilities very seriously. I love my office, I love being a chiropractor. My patients are one of my number one priorities and responsibilities, and so it means the world to me to be here for them. And leading up until this point, I have only ever closed my office for a hurricane, and if I physically could not get here, which I think was only 2 other times because of a stomach bug that my son had. And so I said, you know, I'm gonna go. If I can't make it, I'll close the day, but I'm gonna try. And so I went to work, and I could not make it through the morning shift. My cough was so bad. I could not breathe. I could not speak to people. I kept apologizing because my allergies were so bad. And so finally I'm like, this isn't making sense. I need to close the day. I can't do this. And so we took a chest x-ray, and my chest x-ray looked like classic pneumonia, a lung full of pneumonia. And so this is when I sent the x-rays out to my doctor and began treatment for pneumonia. So this was about a 3-week process of being treated for pneumonia, multiple x-rays, multiple antibiotics to track the progress, and my symptoms were getting worse. I was feeling worse, and my body just was not responding. So during these 3 weeks, but especially that first week, that Monday, I hit rock bottom that day. Probably throughout my entire journey, that is the one day that I will never forget. After I took the x-ray, it took me 45 minutes to get off the floor of my x-ray room and to make it to my car. I have text messages to my husband on the way home, sending him my live location because I didn't know if I was gonna make it home that day. I just felt like I was gonna pass out. I was so tired. By the time I got home, I pretty much crawled into my house and into my bed. When I laid down, at this point in time, I could still lay down flat. I wasn't having to be perfectly upright yet, but I was propped up a little bit, and it just felt like there was an elephant on my chest. I could not breathe. My heart was racing. And a few weeks prior, Steve had laid on my chest and said, "Your heart is beating so fast." And I noticed at that point in time that my resting heart rate was increased. And so by this point in time on that Monday, my resting heart rate was around 120. I was coughing a deep barking cough. It was so bad and would get so bad over the following couple weeks that I had stress incontinence. My throat hurt, my voice was hoarse, I couldn't catch my breath. And so at this point, everything I really was experiencing was respiratory related. So fatigue, fever, the cough, shortness of breath, things that could be pneumonia. And so after a couple weeks of it not responding, I had a conversation with my doctor. And even prior to meeting her that day, I knew in my gut what it was. And so I met with her and we had the discussion that we had to rule out lymphoma because it could be hiding behind the pneumonia. 2 days later, I had my CT scan and the pneumonia was the lymphoma. And so the tumor was so large, it had taken over that whole lung cavity. And so this was when my treatment journey really began and the path to diagnosis started. But a lot of times people think that we hear, "You have cancer." That wasn't my story. That wasn't part of my journey. Nobody ever sat me down and said, "You had cancer." Because of what my background is in healthcare, I had known that things weren't making sense and that there was something else going on. And so a big part of this whole learning process for me was learning to listen to my body in a whole different way, because things aren't always textbook and things don't always make sense. And nobody expects a 30-year-old female who is a beacon of light and health for their community, somebody who works out and eats well and prioritizes wellness and preventative health. Nobody ever thinks that you would be the one with stage 4 cancer. And so I have learned how important rest is, how essential it is to prioritize our health and wellness and how we feel, because we are the only ones who are responsible for that, but we can't take care of anybody else if we don't take care of ourselves. And that was a big thing for me is, I'm a wife, I'm a mom, I'm a doctor. I don't have time for this. I remember saying to my husband, before I even met with my doctor, before we knew that it was cancer, I said, I can't have cancer. I don't have time for this. And now looking back, I realized that cancer was one thing that taught me what I do have time for. And it's for myself and it's for my family. And it's to be able to live a life full of abundant health and blessings and wellness, but if we're not prioritizing that, we can't just have that. And so what holistic health looks like for me now is so different. Yes, it's physical, but it's mental, it's spiritual, it's emotional, it's financial. Through all of this, I have learned that unless we're prioritizing all of that, we can never truly be healthy. And so even as somebody who just came out of chemo treatments, I'm sitting here feeling like I am my healthiest self I've ever been, because I'm able to prioritize things that I didn't prioritize before, like caring for myself, like rest and relaxing, reading a good book if that's what you feel like doing. And so I encourage you to fill your cup with the things that make you healthy and that make you feel well, because at the end of the day, if we don't have our health, we just don't have anything. And so my story is a little bit all over the place. It's not organized, it's not perfect, but that's my life and that's my journey. So I'll give you a little recap. I'm sure there's going to be things that I forget, so I will write them down. I'll give you a description. But the symptoms leading up to my cancer diagnosis were back pain, fatigue, headaches, fever, night sweats, weight loss, shortness of breath, a cough, overall just feeling unwell and off. And if I looked back through my notes, probably a whole lot more things, but I pretty much experienced it all. And so I'm so thankful that everything came together when it did, because I was told the reason that my body masked the symptoms that I had and for so long was because of how healthy I was. So I promise you, prioritizing and investing in your health is an asset that you will need, not only in case something comes up where you need to mentally and physically battle through it, but just to enjoy life to the biggest and fullest extent that you can. Because I know that if my body was not mentally and physically strong going into my battle, it wouldn't be mentally and physically strong coming out of it. So prioritize yourself, you deserve it. Thank you for listening to my symptoms and the journey up until starting the process of getting a diagnosis. I'm honored that you guys are choosing to watch my videos and be part of my journey. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being here. I love you and I hope you have a blessed day.